The rain hammered against the tin roof of the old cabin like 1,000 angry fists. Inside, Elijah Brooks sat motionless in the dark, his broad shoulders hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. At 47, his body still carried the strength of his years in the military, but the weight he bore now had nothing to do with muscle. It was the kind of heaviness that settled in the chest and refused to leave. His short-cropped hair was flecked with gray, and his beard, equally grizzled, framed a face marked by deep lines around the eyes. Not laugh lines, the other kind. Shadow lay at his feet, a magnificent German shepherd with a coat of black and gray that seemed to absorb the dim light from the dying fire. The dog's amber eyes were open, watchful, always watchful. Shadow had been with him for 5 years now, ever since Elijah left the service and came back to Ashford, the small southern town where he'd been born. They'd trained together, fought together, and now they survived together. In the silence of the cabin, the dog's steady breathing was the only sound that kept Elijah tethered to the present. You know that feeling when you come home, but home doesn't feel like home anymore? That was Elijah's reality. Ashford had changed, or maybe he had. Either way, the place felt foreign. The streets he'd walked as a boy were cracked and overgrown. The houses he remembered were boarded up or torn down, and the people, the ones who were still there, looked at him like he was a ghost. Maybe he was. He'd returned with nothing but a duffel bag, a few medals he never wore, and a dog who understood him better than any human ever could. The cabin belonged to his late uncle, a man who'd lived on the edge of town away from everyone. It was small, drafty, and smelled like damp wood, but it was his now, and it was quiet. That was what mattered most. Quiet. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sparse interior of the cabin for a split second. A rickety table, a single chair, a cot in the corner, and not much else. Elijah didn't need much. He'd learned to live with less overseas. But tonight the storm felt different. Shadow felt it too. The dog's ears twitched and his head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as if catching a scent that didn't belong. "What is it, boy?" Elijah's voice was rough, underused. He spoke more to Shadow than to people these days. The dog stood, his body tense, and moved toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not aggressive but alert. Elijah rose from his chair, every instinct from his years of service kicking in. His hand moved instinctively to his side where a knife hung from his belt. He didn't keep a gun in the cabin. Too many memories attached to those. He crossed the small room in 3 strides and stood beside Shadow, placing a hand on the dog's back. Easy. The wind howled, and for a moment Elijah thought he heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A metallic scraping, faint but deliberate. He waited, listening. There it was again, scraping, dragging, coming from somewhere outside near the back of the cabin. You ever had that moment where your gut tells you something's wrong but you can't see it yet? That's where Elijah was. He grabbed a flashlight from the table, tested it, and opened the door. The rain hit him like a cold slap, soaking through his shirt in seconds. Shadow bolted out ahead of him, moving with purpose through the mud and darkness. Shadow heel. Elijah's command was firm, but the dog ignored him. That wasn't like Shadow. The dog had discipline, better discipline than most soldiers Elijah had served with. If Shadow was disobeying, it meant something serious. Elijah followed, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. The beam of his flashlight cut through the rain, sweeping across the trees, the overgrown grass, the sagging fence line. And then he saw it. Shadow was standing rigid, staring at something half buried in the mud near the old shed that leaned precariously at the edge of the property. Elijah approached slowly, his heart rate steady, but his senses sharp. The object was large, rectangular, and metallic, a chest, an old chest by the looks of it, with rusted iron corners and a heavy padlock that had long since corroded. It was partially unearthed, as if the storm had washed away years of soil and debris, revealing something that had been hidden for a very long time. "Where the hell did you come from?" Elijah muttered, crouching beside it. Shadow nudged it with his nose, then looked up at Elijah as if to say, "Well, open it." Elijah ran his hand over the surface. The metal was cold and rough, covered in layers of rust and dirt. There were no markings, no initials, nothing to indicate who it belonged to or why it was buried here. But something about it felt deliberate. This wasn't just trash. This was hidden. He tried the padlock. It was fused shut, useless. He'd have to break it. He stood and walked back to the cabin, returning a moment later with a crowbar. Shadow watched intently as Elijah wedged the bar under the lock and applied pressure. The metal groaned, resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack. The lock fell into the mud. Elijah hesitated. You know that moment when you're about to open something and you just know that whatever's inside is going to change things? That was this moment. He glanced at Shadow, who sat patiently, water dripping from his thick coat. The dog's eyes seemed to say, "Go on." Elijah lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic, were stacks of papers. Old papers, yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. He pulled one bundle out carefully, unwrapping it under the beam of his flashlight. His breath caught. Deeds, property deeds. Dozens of them. Names he recognized. Names from Ashford's black community. Names of families who'd been here for generations. But the dates were wrong. These deeds were from the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. And every single one of them had been marked with red ink. Void. Seized. Forfeited. Elijah's hands trembled as he flipped through them. He found a deed for land that now housed the town's largest shopping center. The original owner, a black farmer named Isaiah Grant, seized in 1948, no reason given. Another deed for property along the river, prime real estate, original owner Ruth Hayes, forfeited in 1952, cause listed as delinquent taxes, but the amount owed was laughably small, clearly fabricated. The pattern was unmistakable: systematic theft, legal theft, dressed up in paperwork and filed away so no one would ever see it. Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew this story. Every black family in the South knew this story. But here it was, documented, undeniable, buried in a chest like a dirty secret. Shadow whined softly, pressing his body against Elijah's leg. The dog could sense the shift in his master's energy. Elijah looked down at him, then back at the chest. There was more inside. Letters, photographs, ledgers. Evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving bankers, lawyers, and officials who'd quietly stripped black families of their land, their wealth, their future, and someone had hidden it all here. But who and why? Elijah carefully rewrapped the papers and carried the chest back to the cabin. Shadow followed closely, his ears still alert. Inside, Elijah set the chest on the table and began laying out the documents one by one. The fire had died down to embers, so he built it back up, needing the light and the warmth. His mind raced. If these documents were real, and he had no reason to think they weren't, then they represented something enormous. Proof. Proof that entire families had been robbed, their land stolen through legal manipulation. Proof that the wealth gap in Ashford, the poverty that plagued the black side of town, wasn't an accident. It was by design, but what was he supposed to do with it? Who would even care? The people who'd committed these crimes were long dead. The families who'd been wronged were scattered, some gone, some barely surviving. And Ashford's power structure, the people who benefited from all this stolen land, they weren't going to welcome this truth. Elijah sat down heavily in the chair, rubbing his face with both hands. Shadow came and rested his head on Elijah's knee, those amber eyes gazing up with quiet understanding. The dog didn't have answers, but he had loyalty. And right now that was enough. "We've got a problem, Shadow," Elijah said quietly. "A big one." The rain continued to hammer the roof, but inside the cabin was warm. Elijah stared at the pile of papers, his mind working through possibilities. He thought about the families he knew, the people who'd struggled their whole lives, never knowing that their great-grandparents had owned land, had built businesses, had been something more than what history had reduced them to. He thought about justice. Real justice, not the kind that came from a courtroom, but the kind that came from truth, from exposure, from forcing people to face what had been done. And he thought about danger, because men who built empires on stolen land didn't like it when someone dug up the receipts. Elijah pulled out his phone. It was old, barely functional, but it had service. He scrolled through his contacts. There weren't many. A few old army buddies, a cousin in Atlanta, and one name that stood out: Marcus Webb. A journalist, someone Elijah had met years ago at a veterans event. Marcus wrote for a black-owned newspaper, one that wasn't afraid to tell uncomfortable truths. Elijah stared at the name for a long time. Once he made this call, there was no going back. This would become bigger than him, bigger than Shadow, bigger than this little cabin. It would become a fight. And Elijah was tired of fighting. But then he looked at the papers again. He saw the names: Isaiah Grant, Ruth Hayes. People who'd fought their whole lives just to keep what was theirs, only to have it stolen anyway. People who'd never gotten justice, and he realized he wasn't tired. Not really. He was just waiting for the right fight. Elijah pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. Marcus Webb. Marcus. It's Elijah Brooks. You got a minute? There was a pause. Elijah? Yeah, man, I got time. What's going on? Elijah looked at Shadow, who was still watching him with those calm, knowing eyes. I found something. Something big. And I think you're going to want to see it. What kind of something? Elijah picked up one of the deeds, holding it up to the firelight. The kind that explains why half this town is rich and the other half can't afford to eat. Another pause, longer this time. Then Marcus's voice came back, sharper, more focused. Where are you? Ashford. South Carolina. I can be there in 2 days. Good, bring a camera. And Marcus, yeah? Be careful who you talk to about this. Trust me, understood. The call ended. Elijah set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. Shadow let out a long breath and settled on the floor, finally relaxed. The storm outside was beginning to ease, the rain softening to a steady patter. Elijah stared at the fire, watching the flames dance. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if anyone would care, or if this would change anything at all. But he knew one thing for certain. The chest hadn't been buried by accident. Someone had hidden it, and someone had wanted it to stay hidden, which meant there were people in Ashford who had a lot to lose if the truth came out. And Elijah Brooks, whether he liked it or not, was about to become the most dangerous man in town, because he had proof. And he had nothing left to lose. Shadow lifted his head, ears perked. Elijah listened. In the distance, barely audible over the rain, he heard the sound of a car engine. Headlights swept across the cabin wall, then stopped. The engine cut off. Elijah stood slowly, his hand moving to the knife on his belt. Easy, boy. Shadow was already on his feet, a low growl building in his chest. Someone was outside. And whoever it was, they'd arrived in the middle of a storm. In the middle of the night, at a cabin that no one should have known Elijah was living in. The knock on the door was slow. Deliberate. 3 hard raps. Elijah didn't move. Who's there? A voice muffled by the rain and the door called back. Mr. Brooks? My name is Reverend Thomas. I need to speak with you. It's about the chest. Elijah's blood ran cold. How did anyone know about the chest? He'd only opened it an hour ago, unless someone had been watching. Elijah's hand tightened around the knife handle. Shadow's growl deepened, his body coiled like a spring ready to release. The rain had softened to a whisper, making the silence inside the cabin feel heavier, more oppressive. 3 knocks, a name, a claim about the chest. Nothing about this felt right. How do you know about the chest? Elijah called through the door, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. There was a pause. Then the voice came again, older, measured, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent a lifetime choosing words carefully. Because I'm the one who buried it. 32 years ago. Elijah's mind raced. 32 years. That would put it around 1991, maybe early 92. Whoever this man was, he'd been holding on to this secret for decades. The question was why? And why show up now tonight within hours of Elijah finding it? Step back from the door, Elijah ordered. Hands where I can see them. I understand your caution, son. I'm stepping back. Elijah moved to the window, pulling the torn curtain aside just enough to see outside. In the dim glow of his porch light, which flickered weakly against the drizzle, stood an elderly black man. He wore a long dark coat soaked through, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. But his hands were raised, palms out, empty. No weapon, no threat, just an old man in the rain. Shadow's growl didn't stop, but Elijah gave him a hand signal. The dog sat tense but obedient. Elijah opened the door halfway, keeping his body blocking the entrance. Say what you need to say. The old man lowered his hands slowly. Up close, Elijah could see his face now. Deep lines carved by time and hardship. A neatly trimmed white beard. Eyes that held a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. This was a man who'd been carrying something heavy for far too long. My name is Reverend Samuel Thomas. I was the pastor of New Hope Baptist Church here in Ashford for 43 years. I retired in 2015. He gestured toward the cabin. May I come in? What I have to tell you, it's not something I want to shout in the rain. Elijah studied him for a long moment. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but something in the old man's eyes, something genuine, made him step aside. Hands stay where I can see them. Of course. Reverend Thomas entered slowly, removing his hat and shaking off the rain. Shadow immediately moved to him, sniffing, assessing. The old man stood still, letting the dog do his work. After a moment, Shadow's tail gave a single, tentative wag. That was enough for Elijah. Shadow's judgment was rarely wrong. Sit. Elijah pointed to the chair. He remained standing, positioning himself between the Reverend and the chest on the table. Thomas sat with a grateful sigh, his joints creaking. He glanced at the pile of documents spread across the table, and something like pain crossed his face. So you've already looked inside? I have. Then you know what this is. I know what it looks like. Theft, fraud, a whole lot of crimes dressed up as legal paperwork. Elijah crossed his arms. What I don't know is why you buried it, or why you're here now. The Reverend was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. Because I was a coward, and because I thought burying the truth would protect people, I was wrong on both counts. You ever notice how the hardest truths come from the people you least expect? That's what was happening here. This man, a reverend, a pillar of the community, was about to confess something that had haunted him for over 3 decades. In 1989, Thomas began. I was approached by a man named Carter Hollis. You wouldn't know the name, he died in 2003. But back then, he ran this town, owned half the land, controlled the bank, had every official in his pocket. He came to me because I was someone the black community trusted. He needed me to keep quiet about something. Elijah's jaw tightened. The deeds, the letters. All of it. Thomas looked down at his weathered hands. Carter's father and his father before him, they'd built their empire on stolen land. Black land. They used every trick in the book. Fraudulent tax lines, forged signatures, legal loopholes that only a white lawyer in a segregated courthouse could exploit. By the time I was born, the theft was already complete. But the evidence, that chest you found, it had been kept by Carter's father as insurance. Leverage against the other white families who'd participated. A way to make sure no one ever turned on each other. Shadow moved closer to Elijah, sensing the tension in the room. The Reverend continued. When Carter inherited everything, he inherited that chest too, and it terrified him. Not because he felt guilty, mind you, but because he knew that if it ever got out, if the families who'd been robbed ever saw proof, it would destroy everything his family had built. So he came to me, offered me money to take the chest and bury it somewhere no one would ever find it. And you said yes. Elijah's voice was flat, but the accusation hung in the air. I did. Thomas looked up, meeting Elijah's eyes. He offered me $50,000. Told me I could use it to keep New Hope Baptist running, to help the community. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that the past was the past and digging it up would only cause pain. That the families who'd been wronged, most of them were gone anyway, scattered or dead. What good would it do to expose it all? Elijah felt the anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice controlled. So you took the money, and you buried the proof. I buried it on this property because it belonged to your uncle, Benjamin Brooks. He'd just passed away and the land was sitting empty. I knew no one would come out here. I thought it would stay hidden forever. The Reverend's voice cracked. I thought I was protecting people. But all I did was help the Hollis family keep what they stole. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Elijah looked at the documents on the table, then back at the old man. Why are you telling me this now? Thomas reached into his coat pocket slowly, carefully, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table. Because Carter Hollis's grandson, David Hollis, is running for mayor. And he's using his family's legacy as his platform, talking about how the Hollis family built this town, how they've always taken care of everyone, black and white alike. He's leading in the polls. In 2 weeks, he'll probably win. Elijah picked up the paper. It was a campaign flyer. David Hollis's face, clean-cut and smiling, stared back at him. A legacy of leadership. A future of unity. The words made Elijah's stomach turn. If he becomes mayor, Thomas said quietly, he'll have even more power to keep the truth buried. He'll control the zoning board, the tax assessor's office, everything. And the families who live in poverty on the north side of town, they'll never know that their great-grandparents owned the land that David Hollis's shopping centers are built on. Elijah set the flyer down. You should have come forward years ago. I know. You should have told the truth when it mattered. I know. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. I've lived with that guilt every day. I watched families struggle, watched young people leave town because there was nothing here for them, and I knew I could have done something. But I was afraid. Afraid of what the Hollis family would do to me, afraid of losing my church, my reputation. I was a coward. Shadow whined softly, and Elijah realized he'd been clenching his fist so hard his knuckles had gone white. He forced himself to breathe. Anger wouldn't help. Not now. So what do you want from me? Thomas looked up, and for the first time there was something like hope in his eyes. I want you to do what I didn't have the courage to do. Take those documents. Show them to people who can do something with them. Journalists, lawyers, historians, anyone who'll listen. The truth needs to come out. And what happens to you when it does? The Reverend smiled sadly. I'm 83 years old, son. I've made my peace with the consequences. If I lose what's left of my reputation, so be it. I'd rather die with a clear conscience than live another day knowing I helped bury the truth. Elijah walked to the window, staring out into the dark. Shadow followed, pressing against his leg. The weight of the decision was settling on him. This wasn't just about exposing a crime from the past. This was about going to war with one of the most powerful families in Ashford, a family that had money, influence, and every reason to want these documents destroyed. But then he thought about the names on those deeds. Isaiah Grant, Ruth Hayes, people who'd worked their whole lives only to have everything stolen. People who'd never gotten justice. People whose descendants were still paying the price. I already made a call, Elijah said quietly, to a journalist. He's coming in 2 days. Thomas let out a long breath as if he'd been holding it for years. Thank God. Don't thank God yet. Elijah turned to face him. Once this gets out, there's no putting it back. People are going to be angry. The Hollis family, they're not going to just roll over, and anyone connected to this, including you, is going to be in danger. I understand. Do you? Elijah's voice was hard. Because I've seen what powerful people do when they're backed into a corner. And it's not pretty. Thomas stood slowly, his old bones protesting. I spent 32 years running from this. I'm not running anymore. Elijah studied the old man's face. There was a kind of peace there, the peace that comes when you finally stop lying to yourself. He'd seen it before, in soldiers who'd finally come clean about things they'd done in the war. It didn't erase the damage, but it was a start. All right, you want to help, then help. I need to know everything. Who was involved? Who knew, who benefited? Names, dates, everything you remember. I'll tell you everything. They sat at the table, and for the next 2 hours, Reverend Samuel Thomas laid it all out. The network of corruption that had stretched across Ashford for generations. The lawyers who'd drawn up the fraudulent documents. The judges who'd rubber-stamped them. The bankers who'd foreclosed on properties based on fabricated debts. And the families, white families, who'd bought the stolen land for pennies on the dollar and built their wealth on it. Shadow eventually settled by the fire, his eyes half closed but his ears still alert. Elijah took notes, filling page after page with names and connections. By the time they finished, the first light of dawn was creeping through the cabin windows. Thomas stood to leave, putting his hat back on. There's one more thing you should know. What's that? Carter Hollis kept files, personal files on everyone he did business with. Insurance, he called it. If those files still exist, they'd have even more evidence. Contracts, financial records, things that would connect everything. Where are they? I don't know. But if I had to guess, I'd say they're somewhere in the Hollis estate. David Hollis still lives in the old family mansion on the east side of town. Elijah walked him to the door. You did the right thing. Coming here, telling the truth. Thomas paused on the porch, looking out at the gray morning sky. I hope so. I truly hope so. He glanced back at Elijah. Be careful, son. The Hollis family doesn't lose gracefully. Neither do I. The old reverend nodded and walked to his car, a beat-up sedan that looked almost as old as he was. Elijah watched him drive away, then close the door. Shadow stood and stretched, looking up at Elijah expectantly. Yeah, I know, boy. We're in it now. The dog's tail wagged once, a gesture of solidarity. Elijah looked at the pile of documents on the table, the notes he'd taken, and the campaign flyer with David Hollis's smiling face. 2 days, Marcus would be here in 2 days. And then the real fight would begin. But first, Elijah needed to make sure these documents were safe. If the Hollis family found out what he had, they'd come for them. And they wouldn't come politely. He carefully gathered all the papers, wrapped them back in the oilcloth, and placed them in a waterproof bag. Then he went outside with Shadow, walking to the edge of his property where an old oak tree stood. He dug a shallow hole beneath the roots, placed the bag inside, and covered it with dirt and leaves. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would do for now. When he came back inside, his phone was ringing. Unknown number. Elijah hesitated, then answered, "Yeah?" A voice smooth and confident came through. "Mr. Brooks, this is David Hollis. I believe we need to have a conversation." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "How did you get this number?" "I have a lot of resources, Mr. Brooks, and I make it my business to know who's living in my town, especially when they start asking questions about things that don't concern them. Is that a threat?" "Not at all. I'm just offering you some friendly advice. Ashford is a small town. People talk, and I'd hate for you to get the wrong impression about my family. Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? Let's have a chat. Clear the air." Elijah looked at Shadow, who was watching him intently. "I'll think about it. You do that. And Mr. Brooks, whatever you think you know, whatever you think you found, I can promise you it's not what it seems. My family has been good to this town for generations. I'd hate to see that legacy tarnished by misunderstandings." The line went dead. Elijah set the phone down. Shadow growled low, sensing the danger. Elijah scratched the dog behind the ears. "Yeah, boy, they know. And it's only going to get worse from here." But Elijah Brooks wasn't afraid. He'd faced worse than David Hollis. And this time he wasn't fighting for survival. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for the truth. And nothing, not money, not power, not threats, was going to stop him. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Elijah hadn't slept. He'd spent the night going over everything Reverend Thomas had told him, cross-referencing names, dates, and properties. The scope of the theft was staggering. Over 40 families stripped of their land across 5 decades. Millions of dollars in current property value, all built on a foundation of fraud and intimidation. Shadow sat by the door, alert and watchful. The dog knew something had shifted. The quiet isolation they'd enjoyed for months was over. Now they were at the center of something dangerous, something that wouldn't resolve itself peacefully. Elijah's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Webb. "Landing in Charleston at 3 p.m., be there by 6. Address?" Elijah typed back the cabin's location, then added, "Come alone. Tell no one where you're going." Marcus's response was immediate. Understood. That gave Elijah 8 hours. 8 hours to prepare, to think through every angle, to anticipate what the Hollis family might do next. David Hollis's call last night wasn't a coincidence. Someone had talked. Either Reverend Thomas had been followed or someone else knew about the chest. Either way, Elijah was already on their radar. He needed more information. He needed to understand who David Hollis really was, beyond the polished campaign image. What kind of man was he dealing with? What were his weaknesses? His connections? You don't fight an enemy you don't understand, and right now Elijah was operating blind. He grabbed his jacket. "Come on, Shadow. We're going into town." The drive into Ashford took 15 minutes on winding back roads. The town itself was split down the middle, literally. Highway 17 ran right through the center, and on the west side sat the affluent neighborhoods. Clean streets, well-maintained homes, parks with fresh paint and new playground equipment. That was where the Hollis family lived, along with the other descendants of the families who'd built their wealth on stolen land. On the east side, where most of the black community lived, the story was different. Potholes went unrepaired. Houses sagged under the weight of deferred maintenance. The schools were underfunded. The library was closed 3 days a week, and the only grocery store had shut down 2 years ago, forcing residents to drive 30 minutes for fresh food. Elijah pulled into a parking spot outside Rosie's Diner, one of the few black-owned businesses still operating on the east side. Rosie had been there since the 70s, serving breakfast and gossip in equal measure. If anyone knew what was happening in Ashford, it was Rosie. "Stay," Elijah told Shadow, cracking the window. The dog settled into the passenger seat, eyes tracking every person who walked by. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, bacon, and decades of accumulated grease. It was early enough that only a few tables were occupied. Older folks mostly, reading newspapers and nursing cups of coffee. Elijah took a seat at the counter. Rosie herself appeared from the kitchen, a short, stout woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She'd known Elijah since he was a boy, before he'd left for the military. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." "Elijah Brooks. Heard you were back." "Hey, Miss Rosie, don't Miss Rosie me. You've been back for months and this is the first time you show your face. What, my food ain't good enough for you anymore?" Elijah managed a small smile. "Been keeping to myself, I noticed." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking. "You want the usual?" "Yeah, thanks." Rosie disappeared into the kitchen, shouting orders at someone in the back. Elijah sipped his coffee and looked around. At a corner table, two men in their 60s were having a quiet conversation, their heads close together. One of them glanced at Elijah, held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Suspicious or cautious. In a town like Ashford, the line between the two was thin. Rosie returned with a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. She set it down in front of him and leaned on the counter. "So, you gonna tell me why you're really here, or you gonna make me guess?" Elijah kept his voice low. "What do you know about David Hollis?" Rosie's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Why you asking about him?" "Just curious." Curious. She wiped down the counter, a practiced motion that gave her time to think. "David Hollis is what you'd call a new generation Hollis. Went to college up north, came back with big ideas about making Ashford better. Talks a good game about unity and progress. Got half the town eating out of his hand. And the other half? The other half knows better. That boy's grandfather, Carter Hollis, was a snake. And his great-grandfather before him was worse. David might smile more and use prettier words, but the blood's the same. He's running for mayor, you know." "I know." Rosie studied him. "You planning on stirring up trouble, Elijah?" "Depends on your definition of trouble." She laughed, a sharp bark of a sound. "Honey, I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen what happens to people who go up against the Hollis family. They lose. Every time. Maybe it's time someone didn't lose." Rosie's smile faded. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You found something, didn't you?" Elijah didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. "Lord have mercy." Rosie shook her head. "Elijah, whatever you found, you need to be smart about this. The Hollis family has eyes and ears everywhere. You so much as sneeze in the wrong direction, they'll know about it. I'm being careful. Careful ain't enough. You need to be invisible, and you need people you can trust." She glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening. "There's a meeting tonight. Community meeting at New Hope Baptist. Reverend Thomas called it. Said he had something important to discuss." Elijah's pulse quickened. "What time?" 7 o'clock. "But Elijah, if you're planning on going, you better be ready. Because once you step into that church and start talking, there's no taking it back." "I know." Rosie straightened up, her businesslike demeanor returning. "All right then. You eat your breakfast. And you be careful, you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." Elijah finished his meal in silence, his mind already working through the implications. Reverend Thomas was moving faster than he'd expected. A community meeting meant he was going public with what he knew. That was brave. It was also incredibly dangerous. When Elijah stepped outside, Shadow was standing in the truck bed, his hackles raised, staring at something across the street. Elijah followed his gaze. A black SUV with tinted windows sat idling in front of the old hardware store. It hadn't been there when he'd arrived. Elijah opened the driver's door slowly, keeping the vehicle in his peripheral vision. Shadow jumped down from the bed and climbed into the cab, his eyes never leaving the SUV. As soon as Elijah started the engine, the SUV pulled away, disappearing around the corner. "Yeah, I saw it too, boy." Elijah's jaw tightened. They were being watched, and they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. He drove back toward the cabin, but instead of going home, he took a detour. There was someone else he needed to talk to. Someone who might have information about the Hollis family that even Reverend Thomas didn't know. 20 minutes later, Elijah pulled up to a small house on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, the paint was peeling, but the porch was swept clean and a light burned in the front window. This was the home of Luther Jackson, a man in his 90s who'd been a janitor at the county courthouse for over 40 years. If anyone had seen the inner workings of Ashford's legal system, it was Luther. Elijah knocked on the door. After a long moment, it opened a crack, revealing a wizened face and sharp, suspicious eyes. Who's that? Mr. Jackson, my name is Elijah Brooks. I'm Benjamin Brooks's nephew. The door opened wider. Benjamin's boy. I heard you came back. Army, wasn't it? Marines. Marines. Even better. Luther stepped aside. Come on in then. Don't just stand there letting the heat out. The inside of the house was cluttered but clean. Books and newspapers were stacked on every surface. A small television flickered in the corner. The volume turned low. Shadow followed Elijah inside and Luther eyed the dog approvingly. That's a good-looking animal. Military dog? He is. Thought so. Got that look about him. Luther gestured to a worn couch. Sit, you want coffee? No, thank you, sir. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Time. Luther chuckled as he settled into an armchair. I got nothing but time, son. What's on your mind? Elijah chose his words carefully. I'm looking into some old property records. Deeds from the 40s and 50s. I was told you worked at the courthouse back then. Luther's expression grew guarded. I worked there. Cleaned floors, emptied trash. Didn't pay attention to much else. I think you paid more attention than people gave you credit for. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. You talking about the land thefts? Yes, sir. And you think I know something about them? I think you saw things. Things that other people missed. Luther leaned back in his chair, his gnarled hands resting on the armrests. Son, what I saw and what I can prove are two different things. And what I can prove and what anyone will believe are two more different things on top of that. I'm not asking you to prove anything. I'm just asking you to tell me what you know. Luther studied him for a long time, his old eyes searching Elijah's face. Finally he spoke. I saw paperwork disappear. Saw judges sign off on foreclosures that didn't make sense. Saw lawyers walk into the clerk's office with one set of documents and walk out with another. And I saw black families get thrown off land they'd owned for generations, all legal and proper, with the law on the white man's side. Did you ever see who was behind it? Didn't have to see. Everyone knew. Carter Hollis ran that courthouse like it was his personal office. Judge Whitmore was on his payroll. So was half the county commission. They had a system. Find a black landowner, dig up some excuse, tax lien, unpaid debt, didn't matter if it was real or not, and then seize the property. Hollis would buy it at auction for next to nothing. Then he'd resell it to one of his friends for 10 times what he paid. Made millions, and no one stopped him. Who was going to stop him? The sheriff? The mayor? They were all in on it. Luther's voice grew bitter. And the folks who got robbed, they didn't have money for lawyers. Didn't have connections. Couldn't fight back. So they left. Scattered to Atlanta, Charlotte, up north. Left everything behind. Elijah felt the anger building in his chest again, but he kept his voice calm. Mr. Jackson, if someone were to bring evidence of all this to light, would you be willing to talk about what you saw? Luther's eyes widened slightly. You got evidence? I might. The old man let out a long, shaky breath. Lord have mercy. After all these years, he looked at Elijah. Son, you understand what you're up against? The Hollis family ain't just rich. They're connected. They got lawyers, judges, politicians. You come at them with evidence, they'll bury you in legal paperwork before you can blink. And if that doesn't work, they'll bury you some other way. I know the risks. Do you? Because I've seen men go up against them before. Good men, strong men, and every one of them lost. Every single one. Maybe they didn't have what I have. Luther leaned forward. And what's that? The truth, and people who are finally ready to hear it. The old man studied him, then slowly nodded. All right. If you're serious about this, if you're really going to take them on, then yeah, I'll talk. I'll tell anyone who'll listen what I saw. I'm 93 years old. What are they going to do to me that time ain't already done? Elijah stood and extended his hand. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Luther shook it, his grip still surprisingly strong. You be careful, son. And you watch your back. The Hollis family don't play fair. Neither do I. As Elijah drove back to the cabin, Shadow rode with his head out the window, the wind ruffling his thick coat. The pieces were coming together. Reverend Thomas. Luther Jackson. The documents? Marcus Webb arriving in a few hours. And tonight, a community meeting where the truth would start to come out. But Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. David Hollis's phone call. The SUV watching him. The speed with which they'd learned about the chest. Someone on the inside was feeding them information. Someone close to the people Elijah was trying to trust. When he pulled up to the cabin, he sat in the truck for a moment, scanning the tree line, the road, the surrounding area. Everything looked normal. But normal didn't mean safe. Shadow jumped out and immediately began a perimeter check, nose to the ground, moving in widening circles around the property. Elijah watched him work, trusting the dog's instincts more than his own eyes. After a few minutes, Shadow returned and sat at Elijah's feet. All clear. Elijah went inside and retrieved the documents from their hiding place beneath the oak tree. He spread them out on the table one more time, making sure he had everything organized for when Marcus arrived. Deeds, letters, financial records, and the notes from Reverend Thomas's confession. It was all there. A complete picture of systemic theft spanning 5 decades. His phone rang. "Marcus, I'm 30 minutes out. Still good to meet?" "Yeah, come straight to the cabin. And Marcus, when you get here, park behind the building, out of sight from the road. You expecting trouble? I'm expecting everything. Copy that. See you soon." Elijah ended the call and looked at Shadow. "All right, boy, here we go. Once Marcus gets here and sees these documents, there's no stopping this. It's going to explode." "You ready for that?" Shadow's tail wagged once. That was answer enough. 28 minutes later, Elijah heard the sound of tires on gravel. He moved to the window, hand resting on his knife. A silver sedan pulled around the cabin and parked behind it, just as he'd instructed. A man got out, mid-30s, black, wearing jeans and a heavy jacket. He carried a backpack and a camera case. Marcus Webb. Elijah opened the door. "Marcus, Elijah, good to see you, man." They shook hands. Marcus gestured to Shadow. "And this must be your partner." "That's Shadow." Marcus extended a hand for the dog to sniff. Shadow investigated, then gave a small wag of approval. "Beautiful animal. He's more than that. He's the reason we found what we found." Marcus's expression grew serious. "Then let's see it." For the next hour, Elijah walked Marcus through everything. The chest, the documents, Reverend Thomas's confession, Luther Jackson's testimony. Marcus took photographs of every page, made detailed notes, and asked sharp, incisive questions. This was a man who knew how to build a story, how to find the threads that connected everything. When Elijah finished, Marcus sat back and let out a low whistle. Elijah, this is huge. This isn't just a local corruption story. This is a blueprint for how systemic theft worked across the entire South. If we can prove this, if we can get this in front of the right people, it could trigger investigations in dozens of towns. That's what I'm hoping. But it's also going to make you a target. The Hollis family isn't going to let this go quietly. "I know." Marcus looked at him. "Are you ready for that? Really ready?" Elijah thought about the names on those deeds. Isaiah Grant, Ruth Hayes. Families who'd never gotten justice, descendants who were still paying the price for crimes committed generations ago. "Yeah, I'm ready." Marcus nodded. "Then let's do this right. I'm going to need to verify everything independently. Talk to Reverend Thomas myself. Interview Luther Jackson. Get official records from the county courthouse to corroborate these documents. That's going to take a few days. We don't have a few days. There's a community meeting tonight at New Hope Baptist. Reverend Thomas is going to start talking." "Tonight?" Marcus looked alarmed. "Elijah, that's too fast. If this goes public before we have all our ducks in a row, the Hollis family will shut it down. They'll discredit Thomas, discredit you, make the whole thing disappear. It's already in motion. I can't stop it now." Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. All right. Then I'm coming to that meeting. I'll document everything, and first thing tomorrow I start verifying. But Elijah, after tonight, you need to lay low. Let me handle the investigation. Because once you show your face at that church, you're going to have a target on your back. I've had worse. Maybe. But this time the enemy's wearing a suit and tie, and those are the ones you can't see coming. At 6:30, Elijah, Shadow, and Marcus climbed into Elijah's truck and headed toward New Hope Baptist Church. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. As they drove through the east side, Elijah saw people walking toward the church. Dozens of them. Word had spread. The church parking lot was already full when they arrived. Cars lined the street. People stood in clusters on the lawn, talking in hushed voices. There was an energy in the air, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Something important was about to happen, and everyone knew it. Elijah parked a block away. "Shadow, stay." The dog whined softly but obeyed, settling into the truck bed where he could watch the street. As Elijah and Marcus walked toward the church, Elijah noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. The same one from this morning. Two men sat inside watching. One of them lifted a phone to his ear. They're here, Marcus murmured. Yeah, they are. Inside, the church was packed. Every pew was full and people lined the walls. The air was thick with tension. At the front, Reverend Samuel Thomas stood at the pulpit looking older and frailer than he had the night before. But there was a strength in his posture, a resolve that hadn't been there in decades. When he saw Elijah enter, he gave a small nod. Elijah and Marcus found a spot along the back wall, and then Reverend Thomas raised his hands, calling for quiet. Brothers and sisters, thank you for coming tonight. What I'm about to tell you I should have told you 32 years ago. And I pray to God that He and you can forgive me for my silence. The room went completely still, and then Reverend Thomas began to speak. He told them everything: the chest, the deeds, the theft. He named names, listed properties, and laid bare the conspiracy that had robbed generations of black families in Ashford. As he spoke, Elijah watched the faces in the crowd. Shock, anger, tears, recognition. People were connecting the dots, understanding for the first time why their grandparents had lost their land, why their families had struggled, why the wealth gap in Ashford was so stark. And in the back of the room, Elijah saw someone else. A man in an expensive suit, arms crossed, face impassive. David Hollis he'd come to watch, to see how much damage was being done. And when his eyes met Elijah's, there was no mistaking the message: this was war. The silence in New Hope Baptist Church after Reverend Thomas finished speaking was absolute. 200 people sat frozen, processing what they'd just heard. Some wept quietly. Others stared at the floor, their hands clenched into fists. A few whispered to their neighbors, confirming names, dates, connecting their own family histories to the story that had just been laid bare. Elijah kept his eyes on David Hollis. The man hadn't moved from his position near the door, but his jaw was tight, and his eyes had gone cold. This wasn't just a political problem for him anymore. This was an existential threat to everything his family had built. Marcus was already filming, his camera discreetly capturing the reactions of the crowd. This was history unfolding in real time, and he knew it. An older woman in the third row stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. My grandmother was Ruth Hayes. She owned land by the river. Beautiful land. She told me stories about it when I was a girl, about how she'd worked that land with her own hands. But when I was 10, men came and took it. Said she owed money she didn't owe. Said if she didn't leave, they'd arrest her. Tears streamed down her face. She died believing she'd failed us, that she'd lost our inheritance because she wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough, but it wasn't her fault. They stole it from her. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. Others began to stand, sharing their own stories. A man whose grandfather had owned a successful store on Main Street, seized under false pretenses. A woman whose uncle had been a farmer with 200 acres, taken through a fraudulent tax lien. Story after story, all connected by the same thread: the Hollis family and their network of corrupt officials. David Hollis finally moved. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of reconciliation that felt calculated, rehearsed. Folks, please. I understand you're upset. These are serious allegations and they deserve serious consideration. But let's not jump to conclusions based on the confession of one man who admits he took money to bury evidence. The room erupted. People shouted at him, anger boiling over after decades of being told to be patient, to wait, to trust the system. Reverend Thomas raised his hands, calling for calm, but the damage was done. The community's rage had found a target, and that target was standing in the back of their church. You want to talk about evidence? A voice cut through the chaos. Elijah stepped forward, his deep voice carrying authority. The room quieted. I have the documents. Every deed, every seizure notice, every fraudulent claim. They're real. They're documented. And they prove exactly what Reverend Thomas just told you. David Hollis's eyes narrowed. And who are you? My name is Elijah Brooks. I found the chest on my property 4 days ago. Convenient timing, Mr. Brooks, right before an election. David's voice took on a sharper edge. You show up in town, no job, no ties to the community, living in a rundown cabin, and suddenly you're a crusader for justice? Forgive me if I'm skeptical. Skeptical all you want. The documents speak for themselves. Documents that were allegedly buried by a man who just confessed to taking bribes. Documents that no independent expert has verified. For all we know, they're forgeries designed to destroy my family's reputation and interfere with a democratic election. It was a smooth pivot, Elijah had to admit. David was trying to reframe this as a political attack rather than a historical reckoning, and it might work if Elijah didn't have more ammunition. Then let's verify them, Elijah said calmly. I've already contacted a journalist with the Charleston Chronicle. Marcus Webb is here tonight, and he's going to independently authenticate every document. We'll also be reaching out to historians, legal experts, and the families who were robbed. If you're so confident these are forgeries, you should welcome the investigation. David's expression flickered just for a moment. That was fear. An investigation by a biased media outlet isn't the same as due process. Then let's have due process. Let's bring this to the county prosecutor. Let's get law enforcement involved. Unless, of course, you're worried about what they'll find. The crowd was watching this exchange like a tennis match. David realized he was losing ground. He changed tactics, his voice softening, becoming almost sympathetic. Look, I understand there's pain in this room, real pain. And I'm not denying that injustices happened in the past. My own ancestors may have participated in systems that were wrong, deeply wrong, but that was generations ago. I can't change what happened in 1948 or 1952. None of us can. What I can do is work to make Ashford a better place for everyone. Moving forward. That's what my campaign is about. Unity, progress, healing. It was a good speech. Rehearsed, probably. Prepared for the inevitable moment when his family's past came back to haunt him. And it might have worked except for what happened next. Luther Jackson stood up. At 93, he moved slowly, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong. I was there, David. I saw your grandfather do it. I watched him forge documents, bribe judges, and steal land from people who couldn't fight back. And I saw your father benefit from it, and now I'm watching you stand here and pretend it doesn't matter, because it happened generations ago. David's polished demeanor cracked. Mr. Jackson, with all due respect, you were a janitor. You didn't have access to legal documents or proceedings. You're misremembering events from 70 years ago. I cleaned those offices every night for 40 years. I emptied trash cans full of documents your grandfather thought no one would ever see. I watched him and Judge Whitmore meet in the courthouse after hours, dividing up land they'd stolen. Don't you dare tell me I'm misremembering. The room erupted in applause. David Hollis looked around, realizing he'd lost this crowd. There would be no salvaging his reputation here tonight. He turned and walked out of the church without another word. But Elijah saw the way his hands clenched at his sides, the way his shoulders tensed. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After David left, Reverend Thomas spoke again. I know many of you are angry. You have every right to be. But I want to ask you something. What do we do now? How do we move forward? An older man stood. We sue. We get lawyers and we sue the Hollis family for everything they stole. That'll take years, someone else said. Decades, maybe. And cost money we don't have. We go to the media, a younger woman suggested. Make this national. Put pressure on them. Marcus spoke up from the back. I can help with that. My publication has connections with larger outlets. If you're willing to go on record, tell your stories, we can make sure this gets the attention it deserves. The conversation continued for another hour. Plans were made. A legal fund was discussed. People volunteered to search their own family records for additional evidence. By the time the meeting ended, there was a sense of purpose in the room, a collective determination to see this through. But Elijah knew the hard part was just beginning. David Hollis wasn't going to roll over. He was going to fight back with everything he had. And men with that much to lose were capable of anything. As people filed out of the church, Marcus pulled Elijah aside. That was intense. You handled Hollis well. He's not done. Not even close, I know. Which is why I think you should stay somewhere else tonight. Not the cabin. Somewhere unexpected. I'm not running. I'm not asking you to run. I'm asking you to be smart. You just humiliated one of the most powerful men in this county in front of 200 witnesses. He's going to retaliate. Elijah looked out at the parking lot. The black SUV was gone, but he didn't find that comforting. If anything, it was more ominous. All right. I'll figure something out. Good, I'm staying at a motel on Route 17, room 12. If you need anything, call me. I'm going to start making calls tonight, reaching out to my editors, getting the ball rolling on the story. They walked back to Elijah's truck together. Shadow was exactly where Elijah had left him, alert and watching. The dog jumped down when he saw them approach. immediately moving to Elijah's side. "That's one hell of a dog," Marcus said. "He's kept me alive more than once." "I believe it." Marcus headed to his own car. "Be careful, Elijah, and watch your back." Elijah drove away from the church, but instead of heading to the cabin, he took a winding route through town, checking his mirrors constantly. No one followed. At least no one he could see. He ended up at Rosie's diner, which was closed for the night, and parked behind it. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Miss Rosie? It's Elijah. I need a favor." 20 minutes later, Rosie pulled up in her old Buick. She got out, looked at Elijah and Shadow, and shook her head. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, boy." "I know. And now you need a place to stay because you're worried the hornets are coming for you." "Something like that," Rosie sighed. "My nephew's got a hunting cabin about 15 miles north of here. Hasn't used it in years. It's rustic, no electricity, but it's got a roof and it's off any main road. You can stay there tonight." "Thank you." She handed him a key and a hand-drawn map. "You take care of yourself. And that dog of yours." "I will." The cabin Rosie described was more of a shack, but it was hidden deep in the woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail. Elijah and Shadow settled in for the night. No fire, no lights, just darkness and the sound of the forest around them. Shadow lay by the door, his breathing steady but his ears alert to every sound. Elijah didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the wall, his knife within reach, and thought about what came next. The documents were safe, hidden in multiple locations now. Marcus had copies, both digital and physical. Reverend Thomas and Luther Jackson were willing to testify. The community was mobilized. But none of that would matter if David Hollis managed to destroy Elijah's credibility before the story could gain traction. Around 3 in the morning, Elijah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake tonight, Mr. Brooks. Walk away now while you still can." Elijah deleted the text and turned off his phone. Threats meant he was getting close to something they desperately wanted to protect. That was good. Fear made people sloppy. As dawn broke, Elijah and Shadow made their way back to civilization. He needed to check on the cabin, make sure it hadn't been vandalized or searched. When he arrived, everything looked normal from the outside. But Shadow's hackles went up the moment they stepped onto the property. "What is it, boy?" The dog moved cautiously toward the cabin door, which Elijah was certain he'd locked. It was now slightly ajar. Someone had been inside. Elijah drew his knife and pushed the door open. The interior had been ransacked. Furniture overturned, drawers emptied, floorboards pried up. They'd been looking for the documents. And when they didn't find them, they'd left a message, spray-painted across the wall in red letters. "Last warning." Elijah stood in the destroyed cabin, looking at the message. Shadow growled low, smelling the intruders who'd been there hours before. This was psychological warfare. They wanted him scared, wanted him to understand that they could get to him anytime they wanted. But Elijah had been through worse. Much worse. Broken furniture and spray paint didn't scare him. What it did was confirm that he was winning. You don't threaten someone unless you're afraid of what they can do to you. He pulled out his phone and took photos of everything. Then he called Marcus. "They hit my cabin last night. Tore the place apart looking for the documents." "Jesus, are you okay?" "I'm fine. I wasn't there." "Good. Listen, I've been on the phone all night. My editor loves this story. We're going to run it tomorrow, front page. I've also reached out to the Charleston Post and the Atlanta Constitution. They're both interested. By this time tomorrow, the Hollis family is going to be under a microscope. That's good, but it also means they're going to get more desperate." "I know, which is why I think you should come to Charleston. Stay with me for a few days, lay low until the story breaks and there's public attention on this." "Can't do that. Elijah, these people just broke into your home." "Exactly. Which means if I run now, they win. They get to control the narrative. Say I fabricated everything and disappeared when people started asking questions. No, I'm staying right here." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "All right, but at least let me send someone to watch your back. I know a private investigator, ex-cop, good guy. He owes me a favor. I don't need a babysitter. You need someone who can document any further attempts to intimidate or harm you. Think of it as insurance. If something happens to you, there's a witness." Elijah considered this. It made sense. "All right, but tell him to stay out of sight. I don't want to spook anyone who might be watching." "Will do. His name is Terrence. He'll be there by noon." After the call ended, Elijah spent the morning cleaning up the cabin and reinforcing the locks. Shadow helped by patrolling the property, marking territory and making it clear that this space was now defended. Around 11, Elijah drove into town to pick up supplies. As he walked down Main Street, he noticed people staring at him. Word had spread fast. Some people nodded in respect. Others looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the attention he was bringing to town. And a few, mostly older white men, glared at him with open hostility. At the hardware store, the clerk, a young white guy Elijah didn't recognize, refused to serve him. "We don't want your business here." "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Get out." Elijah could feel the anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm just trying to buy a lock. And I'm just trying to run a business without troublemakers. Leave. Now." Before Elijah could respond, another voice cut in. "I'll sell him the lock." An older black man, one of the store's other employees, stepped forward. His name tag read Gerald. He looked at the younger clerk. "Your daddy would be ashamed of you, Brian. Denying service because you don't like what a man stands for. Daddy would agree with me. Your daddy was a good man before you and your uncle filled his head with Hollis. Propaganda." Gerald turned to Elijah. "Come on, son. I'll ring you up at the back register." As Gerald helped Elijah find what he needed, he spoke quietly. "People are talking about what happened last night at the church. Some folks are real upset. Others are saying it's about time someone stood up. Which side are you on?" "The side of truth." "Always have been." Gerald handed him the lock. "You be careful, Mr. Brooks. The Hollis family has a long reach. And they don't forgive. Neither do I." Back at the cabin, Elijah found a man waiting for him. Mid-40s, black, with the solid build of someone who took fitness seriously. He wore jeans and a jacket, and his posture screamed law enforcement even though he was no longer on the job. "Terrence Williams." He extended a hand. "Marcus sent me. Elijah Brooks, I know. You're all anyone's talking about this morning." Terrence glanced at Shadow, who was watching him carefully. "Marcus told me you had a military dog. Impressive animal. He is. What's your plan?" "I'll set up surveillance on the property. Cameras, motion sensors. Anyone comes snooping around, we'll know about it. I'll also be doing periodic drive-bys, checking for tails, watching for patterns. My job is to make sure nothing happens to you that doesn't get documented." "Sounds good." They spent the afternoon setting up the security system. It was basic but effective. By evening, the cabin was as secure as Elijah could make it, without turning it into a fortress. Terrence left around 7, promising to check in every few hours. Elijah fed Shadow and made himself a simple dinner. As he ate, he thought about tomorrow. The story would break. The Hollis family would respond. And the real fight would begin. Legal battles, media wars, political maneuvering. It was going to get ugly, but for the first time in years, Elijah felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. Not just survival, not just his own peace, but justice for people who'd been wronged, who'd been silenced, who'd been told their pain didn't matter. That night, Elijah slept better than he had in months. Shadow curled up at the foot of his bed, and the forest was quiet around them. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The next morning, Marcus's article hit. Front page of the Charleston Chronicle, "Decades of Theft. How one South Carolina family built an empire on stolen black land." By noon, it had been picked up by major outlets. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times posted an online story. Social media exploded with hashtags like Ashford land theft and justice for Ruth Hayes. Suddenly, the tiny town of Ashford was the center of a national conversation about reparations, land theft, and systemic racism. David Hollis held a press conference that afternoon. He stood outside his campaign headquarters, flanked by lawyers, and read from a prepared statement. "These allegations are false, defamatory, and politically motivated. My family has been a pillar of this community for generations. We've created jobs, supported local businesses, and contributed to the welfare of all Ashford residents. The so-called evidence being circulated is unverified and likely fabricated by individuals seeking to derail my campaign. I have instructed my legal team to pursue all available remedies, including defamation lawsuits against anyone spreading these lies." It was a strong response, calculated, aggressive, but it didn't address the actual documents, the testimony of Luther Jackson, or the confession of Reverend Thomas. It was pure deflection, and the media saw through it. By evening, 3 more families had come forward with their own stories of land theft. A genealogist in Atlanta offered to help trace property records. A team of lawyers from the Southern Poverty Law Center reached out to discuss a class action lawsuit. The momentum was building, and it was becoming something much bigger than Elijah had imagined. But success brought new dangers. That night, as Elijah was preparing for bed, Shadow began barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something urgent, aggressive. Elijah grabbed his knife and moved to the window. Outside, 4 men were approaching the cabin. They wore dark clothing and moved with purpose. One carried a crowbar. Another had a gasoline can. Elijah's heart rate spiked. This wasn't intimidation. This was an attack. He grabbed his phone and dialed Terrence. 4 men outside. Armed. I think they're planning to burn the cabin. I'm 5 minutes away. Can you hold out? We'll find out. Elijah ended the call and looked at Shadow. Protect, the dog understood. He moved to the door, his body coiled, ready. Elijah positioned himself behind the overturned table he'd set upright earlier, using it as cover. The knife felt small in his hand. He wished he had his service weapon, but he'd sworn off guns after leaving the Marines. Now he was regretting that decision. The door exploded inward, kicked off its hinges. The first man through was met by Shadow. The dog launched himself at the intruder, teeth finding the man's arm. The man screamed, stumbling back into his companions, "Get that damn dog off me!" The second man swung the crowbar at Shadow. Elijah moved without thinking. He threw the knife and it buried itself in the man's shoulder. The crowbar clattered to the floor. Elijah was on him in seconds, disarming him, using his own momentum to slam him into the doorframe. The dog understood. He moved to the door, his body coiled, ready. Elijah positioned himself behind the overturned table he'd set upright earlier, using it as cover. The knife felt small in his hand. He wished he had his service weapon, but he'd sworn off guns after leaving the Marines. Now he was regretting that decision. The door exploded inward, kicked off its hinges. The first man through was met by Shadow. The dog launched himself at the intruder, teeth finding the man's arm. The man screamed, stumbling back into his companions. "Get that damn dog off me!" The second man swung the crowbar at Shadow. Elijah moved without thinking. He threw the knife and it buried itself in the man's shoulder. The crowbar clattered to the floor. Elijah was on him in seconds, disarming him, using his own momentum to slam him into the doorframe. The other 2 men rushed in. One grabbed Elijah from behind. The other raised the gasoline can, ready to douse the interior. Shadow released the first man and went for the one with the gas can, knocking him down. The can spilled across the floor, the fumes overwhelming. Elijah drove his elbow back into the man holding him, broke free, and spun. His fist connected with the man's jaw. The man went down hard. The first attacker, the one Shadow had bitten, was back on his feet, pulling a gun. "Everyone freeze." Terrence stood in the doorway, his own weapon drawn, aimed at the man with the gun. "Drop it now." The man hesitated. Shadow growled, a low, menacing sound. Slowly, the man lowered his gun and set it on the floor. "On your knees. All of you." The 4 men complied, though the one with the knife still in his shoulder was groaning in pain. Terrence pulled out zip ties and secured them one by one. Then he made a call. "Sheriff's Department? I've got 4 men who just attempted arson and assault at 1847 Old Mill Road. Send units immediately." Within 15 minutes, the cabin was surrounded by flashing lights. Sheriff's deputies arrested all 4 men and took statements from Elijah and Terrence. The lead deputy, a middle-aged white man named Collins, looked genuinely shaken by what had happened. "Mr. Brooks, I want you to know, not everyone in this department agrees with what the Hollis family has done over the years. Some of us want the truth to come out. Do you know who sent these men? I can't prove it yet, but I will, and when I do, there will be arrests. I promise you that." As the deputies hauled the attackers away, Elijah sat on the porch steps, Shadow beside him. Terrence joined him. "That was close. Too close. You handled yourself well. I've had practice." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Terrence spoke. "This is only going to get worse before it gets better. You know that, right?" "I know." "Are you sure you want to see this through?" Elijah looked at Shadow, then at the charred spot on the cabin floor where gasoline had spilled. He thought about the documents, the families, the decades of injustice. He thought about Ruth Hayes and Isaiah Grant and all the others whose names were written on those deeds. "Yeah, I'm sure." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The story continued to grow. National media descended on Ashford. Legal experts analyzed the documents and confirmed their authenticity. Historians place the land thefts in the broader context of post-Reconstruction violence and discrimination. The Southern Poverty Law Center filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 87 families. David Hollis's campaign collapsed. He withdrew from the mayoral race citing personal reasons, though everyone knew the truth. His family's business empire began to crumble as partners distanced themselves and customers boycotted their properties. But the biggest moment came 2 months after that meeting at New Hope Baptist Church. The Hollis family, facing overwhelming legal and public pressure, agreed to a historic settlement. They would return 5 properties to the descendants of the original owners and establish a $50 million reparations fund for families who could prove their land had been stolen. Wasn't perfect justice. It didn't undo decades of poverty and displacement, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a start. On a warm spring morning, Elijah stood on a plot of land that had once belonged to Ruth Hayes. Her great-granddaughter, the woman who'd spoken at the church meeting, now held the deed in her hands. She was crying, but they were tears of joy. "Thank you," she said to Elijah. "Thank you for giving my family back what was ours. I just found the chest. You and your family fought for this. We fought together." Elijah looked around at the crowd gathered for the ceremony. Reverend Thomas was there, older and frailer but smiling. Luther Jackson, now 94, sat in a wheelchair, his eyes bright with satisfaction. Marcus Webb was filming, documenting this moment for posterity, and standing beside Elijah was Shadow, the dog who'd started it all by finding a chest buried in the mud. That evening, back at the cabin, which had been repaired and fortified, Elijah sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His phone rang. It was Marcus. "Hey man, I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" "I'm good. Tired, but good. You should be proud of what you accomplished. We accomplished. This wasn't just me. True, but you are the catalyst. You could have buried that chest again, walked away, minded your own business. But you didn't. No, I didn't. What's next for you?" Elijah looked out at the forest, at the mountains beyond. For the first time since leaving the military, he felt like he had a purpose again. "I think I'm going to stay here. There's more work to do. More families to help. More stories to tell. Need a journalist?" Elijah smiled. "Always." After the call ended, Elijah sat in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the evening. Shadow's steady breathing, the wind in the trees, the distant call of a bird. This was peace. Not the empty, isolating peace he'd sought when he first came to the cabin, but something richer, a peace earned through struggle, through standing up for what was right. He thought about all the people who'd been part of this journey. Reverend Thomas, who'd finally found the courage to tell the truth. Luther Jackson, who'd waited 70 years to be heard. The families who'd shared their pain and their strength. And Marcus, who'd used his platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. But most of all, he thought about Shadow, the dog who'd led him through a storm to find a chest buried in the mud. The dog who'd protected him through threats and attacks. The dog who'd reminded him that sometimes the most important missions are the ones we never see coming. Elijah reached down and scratched Shadow behind the ears. "Good boy. Best partner I ever had." Shadow's tail wagged, his amber eyes gazing up with quiet understanding. They'd found something together. Not treasure, not gold, but something far more valuable. Truth, justice, and a reminder that even in the darkest places, buried under years of lies and silence, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. All it takes is someone brave enough to dig it up, and someone loyal enough to show them where to look. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elijah Brooks sat on his porch, a veteran who'd finally found his war worth fighting. And beside him sat Shadow, the dog who'd changed everything. Together they'd done what many said was impossible. They'd taken on one of the most powerful families in the South. They'd exposed a conspiracy that had lasted generations, and they'd won. But more than that, they'd given hope to people who'd forgotten what hope felt like. They'd shown that the past doesn't have to define the future, that wrongs can be righted even decades later, that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. And in a small town in South Carolina on a warm spring evening, that was everything. The chest had been locked for decades, but now it was open, and the truth it contained had set people free. Sometimes redemption comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it takes the form of an old chest, a loyal dog, and a man who refused to look away when confronted with injustice. This was one of those times, and Ashford, South Carolina would never be the same.